So I'm talking about evolution, capitalism and Buddhism. I'm going to start just by reminding us that the Buddha lived about 2,500 years ago between 500 and 400 BCE in northern India. And the German philosopher Karl Jaspers identified the Buddha as one of the profoundly wise people of what he called the axial age. And the axial age was a period roughly between 800 and 200 BCE. And during that period, what happened was that there emerged in different parts of the world new wise people. So you had the Hebrew prophets in the Middle East, you had Socrates, Plato and Aristotle in Greece, for example. You had Confucius in China, and you had the Buddha in India. And we could argue that these wise people of the axial age gave voice to a new stage in the evolution of the human species. They emphasized placing ethics at the center of the spiritual life in the pursuit of a new kind of humanity. And they emerged. It's worth asking, how come these people emerged during that particular period? Well, they emerged in part due to the evolution of the economic organization of society. So, for example, at the heart of that period of the axial age, we saw the invention of the use of coins for the first time. And we had the beginning and the rise of the first trading markets. All of that was happening during the period of the axial age. And in some societies at least during that period, enough of an economic surplus existed to give some people time to reflect and ponder on the meaning of life. So that more than enough was being produced so that not everybody had to work all the time to produce the food that was needed. So in the Buddha's case, he was living in the emerging economy of the Ganges Plains in northern India. It meant that he and many other holy wanderers could depend upon villagers and townspeople for their food and sometimes for their shelter. So the economic organization of society in that part of the world had developed to the extent that many hundreds, maybe thousands of holy wanderers could get their food given to them by villagers and townspeople every day. But then, for about 2,000 years from the time of the Buddha, there was very little change in the level of economic output or in the standard of living of people all around the world. For much of that time, for much of those 2,000 years, simply because they contain more people than any other regions, India and China were the world's biggest economies. And then, sometime between the 16th and 18th centuries, came a series of changes in conditions in Western Europe that led to the emergence of this economic system we know as capitalism. So after a long period of very little change, the world economy underwent a rapid and profound change, with much suffering associated with the change, but also astonishing growth in output and standards of living, better healthcare, better education, and longer lives. But I would argue now we have reached an impasse of increasing inequality, high levels of unemployment, especially amongst young people, threats to the environment and even to the existence of species. And we've reached this impasse because of a particular form of capitalism, neoliberal form of capitalism, that has come to dominate the world over the last 35 years. The onset of this period was marked, if you like, by the election in the UK in 1979 of Margaret Thatcher, and a year later in the United States with the election of Ronald Reagan. They symbolised a change that had been picking up momentum for some time. And now most economies in the world are involved in what we would describe as a neoliberal form of capitalism. So I want in this talk to explore the links between evolution, capitalism and Buddhism, and my hope is that this exploration will help to open up a discussion as to how our economic system can evolve beyond the current trap of neoliberal capitalism to help reduce suffering and to help all individuals to fulfill their potential in harmony with the environment. And to do this, I want in particular to explore the ideas of three people: the Buddha, and secondly, Adam Smith. Some of you may have heard of Adam Smith, a Scottish moral philosopher who in 1776, at the end of the 18th century, published a book called The Wealth of Nations. And this is seen as the first, and still as one of the most important books on the economics of capitalism. It's one of the foundation books, if you like, of the economics of capitalism. And the third person I want to talk about is Charles Darwin, whose Origin of the Species was published in 1859 and which expounded his theory of evolution. And in looking at these three people, what I hope to do is to draw out two themes common to the thinking of the Buddha, Adam Smith and Charles Darwin. And the first theme is that there are two conflicting sides to human nature. One driven by greed and selfishness, and the other filled with kindness, generosity and selflessness. And the second theme is that things happen in dependence upon conditions. So I want to try and draw out those two themes. And I'm going to start by looking at Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution. If you talk to people about Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, it's often strongly associated in people's minds with the phrase survival of the fittest. And in fact, when you read the early editions of his book, you discover Darwin did not use that phrase, the survival of the fittest, until the 5th edition of his book on the origin of species. Before that, he simply used the term and talked about natural selection. But he borrowed this phrase, survival of the fittest, from a man called Herbert Spencer. And because Herbert Spencer was very much associated with economic theories of the time that were supportive of unrestrained capitalism, Darwin inadvertently encouraged a narrow interpretation of his theory by economists and by others. And the word fittest came to be associated with the strongest, the most selfish and the greediest. That's what people thought the fittest meant. The strongest, the most selfish and the greediest. And actually what Darwin meant by survival of the fittest was those best fitted or suited to their environment would be the ones that survived and prospered. A very different meaning. Those best fitted or suited to their environment would be the ones that survived and prospered. And in reality, Darwin had a broader view of evolution that did not just depend upon the selfish individual. He had a much broader view of evolution. He wrote another book called The Descent of Man. And in that book, he argued that the human species had succeeded and prospered because of characteristics like sharing and compassion. Not the greediest and the strongest and so on, but characteristics like sharing and compassion. He wrote, those communities which included the greatest number of the most sympathetic members would flourish best and rear the greatest number of offspring. So that word sympathetic, in terms of its usage then, is closer to our word empathic now. So you could read that as him saying, those communities which included the greatest number of the most empathic members would flourish best and rear the greatest number of offspring. And more fully he wrote, although a high standard of morality gives only a slight or no advantage to each individual man and his children over men of the same tribe, an advancement in the standard of morality will certainly give an immense advantage to one tribe over another. A tribe including many members who, from possessing a high degree of spirit of patriotism, fidelity, obedience, courage, and sympathy, were always ready to help or aid one another and to sacrifice themselves for the common good, they would be victorious over most other tribes, and this would be natural selection. So Darwin is pointing out that natural selection operates at the level of the individual and at the level of the group. So he's describing two inherited sides to human nature. The selfish individual who may be seeking to outdo others in their group, and the compassionate, empathic individual cooperating with others for the success of the group. But this phrase, survival of the fittest, stuck, and it stuck particularly amongst economists, so that in economics you still find it being used and referred to in the sense of the strongest and most selfish. And partly this is because that interpretation of Darwin's theory seemed to link in with what the Scottish moral philosopher Adam Smith had written earlier at the end of the 18th century in his book The Wealth of Nations. And it seemed to fit in particular with something that Adam Smith called the invisible hand. The invisible hand lies at the heart of a lot of neoliberal economics, and I'll try to explain what Smith believed by that. I should qualify this by saying it's definitely at the heart of neoliberal capitalism and economics, but Smith only mentions it once in The Wealth of Nations, but it's been lifted out and given a lot of power. This is what he wrote. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages. And he continued, every individual necessarily labours to render the annual revenue of the society as great as he can. He generally, indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain, and he is in this led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectively than when he really intends to promote it. In other words, what he's arguing is that what motivates the butcher, the brewer, and the baker, what drives them, is their own self-interest, their own profit. And this, Smith says, is a good thing. Because as long as every individual in society pursues their own gain or profit, chases after their own self-interest, then through the working of the market, everyone in society benefits. And all of this comes about through the operation of an invisible hand. Now, it's said that when you look at this book, The Wealth of Nations, it's argued that Adam Smith did more than anyone else to make capitalism and the pursuit of unhindered self-interest respectable. And from the modern presentation of his ideas by neoliberal economists, you could be forgiven for thinking that this is all there is to Adam Smith. That one statement, that's all that you need to know, but you'd be wrong. Because he also published another book. He was a moral philosopher, and he published a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. This was a book that was published 17 years before The Wealth of Nations, which he then revisited after he'd published The Wealth of Nations and essentially left the same. And in that book, you could argue he wrote as eloquently as anyone has ever done on the futility of pursuing money with the hope of finding happiness. Diametrically opposite argument. Yeah. He revealed a different view of human motivation. In the opening lines of The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he wrote, "However selfish a man may be, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it." And he went on, he argued, if you like, the theory of sympathy. There's that word again, which is closer in modern usage to empathy. He expounded a theory of sympathy or empathy in which he argued that our fellow feeling for the misery of others is founded on our imaginative capacity for changing places in our imagination with the sufferer. So he's painting this picture of human beings concerned for the happiness of others, and he talks about a practice of imaginatively placing yourself in the position of the sufferer.
Isn't that a form of meditation?
Sorry? Yes, it is. That's exactly what I was going to go and say. It reminded me straight away of Shantideva in the Bodhisattva, the way of the Bodhisattva, teaching the practice of exchange of self and other. So there's Adam Smith at the end of the 18th century, knowing nothing at all about Buddhism, certainly nothing about Shantideva, talking about a similar principle. So Adam Smith, like Charles Darwin, understood that people's behaviour is not just dictated by self-interest, but derives from a variety of motives. Like Charles Darwin, he understood that there are two sides to human nature: the selfish, self-interested side and the kind, compassionate side. But modern economics is gripped by the view that it's the pursuit of selfishness that promotes the well-being of the whole of society. And this is the mantra that has become the core ethic of modern neoliberal capitalism. It's the ethic that supersedes all other ethical considerations. There's a very good modern economist called Joseph Stiglitz. He's won the Nobel Prize for Economics, and he's one of the increasing number, actually, of vocal critics of modern neoliberal capitalism. And he's talking about this ethic of selfishness, this ethic in inverted commas. He says this: "To the morally uninspired, it's an appealing idea. Selfishness is the ultimate form of selflessness." Selfishness is the ultimate form of selflessness. Basically, he's saying the view is, it doesn't matter how greedy you are, maybe even how unethical you are doing something that benefits all of society, and therefore your selfish actions are selfless actions. So this is what you find behind much of neoliberal economics, is the belief that human beings are naturally and rationally selfish, and to power an economy requires the promotion of selfishness and greed. And unfortunately, This belief in the power of greed and selfishness takes support from some scientists like Richard Dawkins. In his book, The Selfish Gene, Dawkins writes this: "Let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish." Let us try to teach generosity and altruism because we are born selfish. So the idea behind those words is this: unselfishness or altruism is somehow less natural than selfishness. Our core starting position is selfishness, and we have to be taught how to be generous and altruistic. But he's not actually unchallenged. There are a lot of evolutionary biologists now who challenge that view of Richard Dawkins, and there's two in particular that are very vocal in this. There's an evolutionary biologist called E.O. Wilson and another guy called David Sloan Wilson, and they're at the forefront of a different view. And they go back to Darwin's original argument in The Descent of Man. They say, although it is true that within a group, natural selection may favour the selfish individual, when groups start to compete with each other, those groups that contain more unselfish, cooperative and altruistic members will outcompete other groups in the survival stakes. So they go back to this basic idea of Darwin. They call it a multi-level selection theory of evolution. In other words, they're pointing out that there's a tension in human nature and human society between the selfish individual and the cooperative individual and the cooperative group. And David Wilson expresses it, I think, very nicely in relation to the human world. He says this: "What's good for me is not necessarily good for my family. What's good for my family is not necessarily good for my clan. What's good for my clan is not necessarily good for my nation. And what's good for my nation is not necessarily good for the global environment or economy." In other words, he's arguing that whilst at lower levels selfishness may work to the benefit of an individual in terms of survival and passing on of that particular inheritance line, it doesn't apply the higher you go, that you need different values coming in. So there's a conflict between lower level selfishness and higher level welfare. And David Wilson points out that this, you see this in the biological world as well. So that cancer is an example of, if you think about it, cancer cells selfishly spreading at the expense of other cells within the body without contributing to the common good. And ultimately, they can result in the death of the whole organism. So he's pointing out that maybe similar processes and pressures can be around in the human world. And he gets support for this view from an evolutionary anthropologist called Christopher Byrne. And he's a man who's looked back at the evolution of the human species, and he's also studied what are left of modern hunter-gatherer groups around the world. And his theory is this, his view is this, that he thinks that something shifted in terms of our ancestors' survival around 250,000 years ago, when it was discovered that instead of having lots of individuals hunting, when individuals combined and worked as a team, they had much more success in killing game and getting meat. So teams would work together to drive big animals towards those waiting, who would then kill the animals and you would have more to eat. So there was a different way, if you like, of organising production of what was needed for human survival. But it didn't just end there, because as well as a new way of cooperative hunting, they needed a new way, a new cooperative way of dividing up and distributing the spoils of the hunt. So from extensive study of modern hunter-gatherers, Byrne concludes that rules and practices must have developed to ensure a more egalitarian approach. Not just a more cooperative approach in how the game was killed, but a more egalitarian approach in how the result of the hunt was divided between people. So what he notes is, when you look at modern hunter-gatherer societies, is that they are, first of all, very, very watchful for the tendency of individuals to be free riders. They don't like people who take their share of the spoils of the hunt without contributing fairly to the hunt. And they don't like stronger individuals who claim more than their fair share. And both of these two classes of people, the free riders and the stronger individuals, are ridiculed. There's a development of social rules to ensure that those who are best at cooperating fare better than those who act selfishly. So they ridicule people, they shame people, they shun them. Ultimately, they might exile them, which effectively might mean their death. So it's a very powerful set of socially enforced rules. And what he argues is that over time, this development of social rules created powerful environmental pressures in favour of preemptive self-control. So people avoided getting social penalties. People began to behave in a way to avoid social penalties. And in this way, the pressure for self-control shaped our moral sense. And behavioural rules were internalised such that certain behaviours came to feel clearly right or wrong. And he argues that this is where the sense of shame and guilt comes. They are evolutionary signals of this developing process. And in this way, the social organisation of human societies changed from one that was previously based on fear and dominance of the strongest to one where social selection for collaborative and cooperative activities became dominant. And those who had reputations for being poor cooperators would not be selected for joint ventures. In particular, they would not be selected for raising new humans. So you have, in this way, a breeding of cooperation because of the interaction between the development of cultural rules and human breeding. Altruistic tendencies were strengthened and became part of our evolutionary inheritance. So we have this interplay between genetic and cultural evolution. So it's an important point, so that they make an argument, David Sloan Wilson, E.O. Wilson, Christopher Byrne, that we also have a natural inheritance of a tendency for altruism and cooperation, just as we have a natural evolutionary inheritance of selfishness. And they warn that there can be cultural cancers just as there can be genetic cancers. In other words, they say, for teamwork to exist at any given rung of the social ladder, there must be mechanisms that hold the wolves of selfishness at bay, that hold the cultural cancers at bay. And they say that a nation or the global village is no different in this respect than a human village or a hunter-gatherer group. We need rules and regulations and social practices that hold the cancer of selfishness at bay. So I'll return to that theme later. Are people getting hot?
Yeah.
Shall we?
It's nice and warm.
Shall we switch the? I'll speak up a bit louder.
Yeah, you need to because it's very
Yeah, I'll speak up quite loudly and let me know if you can't hear me or can't tell what I'm saying. Okay, so let's turn to the Buddha. How does the Buddha relate to this discussion? Well, we know that the Buddha identified greed, hatred and delusion as the root causes of the human predicament. That's one of his main teachings. But he also said that we are born with the potential for generosity, loving kindness and wisdom. And which potential dominates, whether it's greed and hatred and delusion, or generosity, loving kindness and wisdom, which potential dominates depends upon what we turn our minds towards and what we cultivate in our lives. So this is why the Buddha placed ethics at the centre of life. He wanted a new form of society in which ethics was at the centre of life. Ethics and compassion have to be developed, and greed and egotism, violence and unkindness have to be shaken off. And he taught that compassion and altruism should not be confined to your own immediate group, your own people, but instead should be extended beyond. And we know this from a very famous sutta, the Karaniya Metta Sutta, the teaching on loving kindness. And in this sutta, in this teaching, he enjoined his followers to cultivate the following intention. For some of you this will be very familiar, but I'm going to read it and remind you of what he says. Whatsoever living beings exist, without exception, whether weak or strong, whether tall and large, middle-sized or short, whether very subtle or very gross, whether visible or invisible, dwelling far away or not far away, whether born already or not yet born, may all beings be happy in themselves. So the Buddha is enjoining us to practice loving kindness, metta, towards all living creatures. He's asking us to direct our metta, our loving kindness, towards those not yet born, towards future generations of humans and future generations of all other species on the planet. We are being asked to act with kindness towards our descendants and the descendants of other species. It's a really important teaching. So we teach that, and we teach the Metta Bhavana meditation practice. And we practice Metta Bhavana, the cultivation of loving kindness, in meditation and in our everyday life. And this is how we develop the antidote, the opposite of hatred. And this is how we weaken the delusion that we exist separately from others and the world around us. By practicing kindness, we break down the barriers between ourselves and others and the world around us. And the antidote for greed is generosity, the practice of giving, dana. The Buddha once commented, "Those who do not praise giving are fools." Those who do not praise giving are fools. And if you read teachings given by the Buddha, especially in the early teachings collected in the Pali Canon, you'll find there that the practice of giving is the foundation and the seed of spiritual development. And in the later Buddhism, the Mahayana, the first of the 6 perfections that a bodhisattva is meant to cultivate, the first perfection is generosity. So whenever the Buddha was teaching to a new group of people, he often started with a talk on giving. And Sangharakshita, the founder of the Triratna Buddhist order and the Triratna Buddhist community, commented that it is as if the teaching is saying, and here I'm quoting Sangharakshita, "You may not be morally scrupulous. You may not be able to meditate even for 5 minutes at a time. You may not dip into the scriptures from one year to the next. But if you aspire to lead any sort of higher life, then at the very least you will give." So the cultivation of generosity directly debilitates greed and facilitates a flexibility of mind that helps to destroy delusion. So if we are to fulfill our progressive evolutionary potential, the Buddha is advocating the cultivation of loving kindness and generosity, an ethical path of care and compassion that is to be followed at the level of the individual and at all other levels of society and of the world. But there's another teaching of the Buddha which I think gives us another helpful perspective on evolution in general, and in particular on the evolution of capitalism, and how we might respond to our current economic and social situation. And this is the teaching which in Sanskrit is known as Pratitya Samutpada, which means conditionality or conditioned arising. It's the core Buddhist teaching, I think, conditioned arising. And the most succinct and general expression of the principle of conditioned arising is this: this being, that becomes. With the arising of this, that arises. This not being, that does not become. With the ceasing of this, that ceases. So it seems very straightforward, but it's critically important, because what this is telling us is that everything in our experience, including ourselves, exists in dependence upon conditions. Nothing exists completely separately. Nothing is fixed and permanent. What we think of as things are in reality processes. We are a process. Everything we see around us is in process. And these processes exist in dependence upon other processes, maybe imaginable numbers of other processes. And they themselves create the conditions for other processes to exist. So we live in a completely interdependent world. And if the conditions are right, then something completely new can emerge. And the whole process of evolution is an example of conditioned arising at work. If you change the conditions, if you change the environment, then the path of evolution changes. If an asteroid hits the world, the dinosaurs die. Those species which survive eventually lead to the human species and others. If that asteroid had not hit, we may not be here. That's an example of conditioned arising. Christopher Birm's description of how a new way of hunting was discovered and how that leads to a new form of altruistic and cooperative organisation of societies, and how that becomes then a natural part of the human evolutionary inheritance, that's another example of conditioned arising. And economic development and the emergence of capitalism is another example of conditioned arising at work. As I said earlier, for 2,000 years after the death of the Buddha, very little changed in the level of output or in the standard of living of people all around the globe. But then, between the 16th and 18th centuries, conditions changed and the economic system we know as capitalism emerged. Now, exactly what changed, what really mattered, what conditions changed to cause the arising of capitalism is hotly debated. And I'm not going to take sides in that debate now. I'm just going to point to some of the conditions that changed that people talk about. So, some people talk about the importance of the Protestant work ethic. We have the Protestant Reformation and then the Protestant work ethic arising, and how that may have had an effect upon the arising of capitalism. We had new forms of government arising in different European states. We had the new emergence of new kind of financial systems, of banks and new forms of financing companies and so on. And we also had And some people say that this is one of the most important reasons for the emergence of capitalism in Western Europe. We had a dramatic increase in wealth concentrated in Western Europe that was created by the forcible removal of native peoples off their land in the Americas and in Africa. So while Native Americans were dispossessed, about 12 million Africans were shipped from one side of the Atlantic to the other. Early this year I was visiting Liverpool. If you go to the docks, the old area where there used to be docks, where there's now lots of museums and everything, there's this incredible collection of very, very impressive buildings dating from Victorian times and so on. And that wealth represented in those buildings was built on the slave trade. That's where it came from, built on the slave trade. So you have lots of different possible conditions that lead to the emergence of capitalism. But what we know is that whatever of those conditions were the most important, it's indisputed that a new dynamic economic system arose during that period. And it's clear that however much people talk about an unregulated or unrestrained capitalism, of course, governments played a huge role in devising rules and regulations that allowed the development of capitalism. One of the conditions for the arising of capitalism and how it has developed in its own particular way since then is very much to do with the rules and regulations created by government. And that's very much true now, how rules and regulations created by national governments and by international treaty govern the economic form of society today. So they're a part of the conditions of how our economic system evolves. Just thinking back to Adam Smith, he wrote the book The Wealth of Nations to challenge the dominant form then of regulations and practices that governed economic trade. He wanted to change the way that the economy worked and change the way that government intervened to create a particular form of market. So this means for us that rules and regulations can be devised that can help or prevent the evolution of a higher or better economic organisation that works for the benefit of humankind and for the benefit of the planet. We have to remember, though, that just as there can be genetic cancers, there can be cultural cancers. And for cooperation and altruistic teamwork to exist and to allow economic organisation to work for the benefit of humankind and the benefit of the planet, there must be mechanisms in the rules and regulations that hold the wolves of selfishness at bay. That's indisputable. So I want to turn, as I get towards the end of this talk, to one example of what I regard as a cultural cancer that is very much affecting the kind of economic organisation we have in the world today. That cultural cancer is the modern multinational corporation, and I'll try to explain why I think of it as a cultural cancer. And this is important because I think what we see at the present moment is, instead of rules and regulations, instead of mechanisms being developed to hold the wolves of selfishness at bay, what we are seeing is the creation of mechanisms that help the wolves of selfishness to dominate even more. So let me step back and explain more fully what I mean. The Buddha teaches us, this is an extension of the theory of conditioned arising. He teaches us that the view of the self as something that is fixed and unchanging and separate is a false view. We are not fixed and unchanging and separate. And by cultivating our inherited tendencies for generosity and kindness, we go beyond our equally inherited tendencies for selfishness, and we can change or evolve into individuals who realise that they, like all phenomena, are empty of fixed self-nature and are interconnected with all things. In other words, we're not fixed, we're not separate, we're not unchanging. We are beings that can evolve and change, and we're interconnected with all things. And the Buddha, the enlightened human being, stands as the symbol of the potential of human evolution. He embodies all of the qualities of a human being who has evolved beyond selfishness. Now, when you look at a multinational corporation, what's happened is that legally and financially, we have allowed the creation of a selfish, purely profit-oriented organisation that exists solely for the benefit of its shareholders. We have deliberately designed a, quote, individual that is incapable of evolving beyond selfishness to loving kindness. An individual that is unlike other individuals in that it is capable of wielding enormous power around the globe. A friend of mine called David Loy, who you may have heard of, he's probably one of the foremost socially engaged Buddhists in the United States, maybe even in the world. He's written a book called Money, Sex, War, Karma, and in that there's a chapter on the corporation.